I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
One signature changed the status of two boys and shattered the illusion that every branch of King Charles's blended family stood on equal ground. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, the king made a decision so stark that even seasoned courtiers understood its meaning immediately. Prince Louis was formally placed on a protected senior royal trajectory. At almost the same moment, Queen Camilla learned that her own grandson had been barred from the privileged royal access she believed was becoming permanent. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat with the final decree before him, reading the last page twice before lowering his pen. The decree, a written order carrying the sovereign's authority, did more than settle a family disagreement. It granted Prince Louis a protected senior royal rank in waiting, meaning his future place within the working monarchy would be secured before adulthood, while Camilla's grandson would lose restricted palace access, closed royal functions, and any developing semi-official position. The king signed without ceremony. He set the pen down. That silence carried the force of judgment because Louis had always been royal by birth, yet this decision transformed birthright into an institutional promise. William and Catherine's youngest son could no longer be quietly pushed aside because he seemed too lively, too young, or less polished than someone older. His future role had been protected by the monarch. Camilla felt the blow immediately. The queen consort had expected adjustments, perhaps limits, perhaps a cooling-off period. Instead, she learned that the restrictions surrounding her grandson were permanent boundaries between the sovereign's private family and the crown's official machinery, the staff, duties, access, and privileges supporting the monarchy's public work. She understood at once that this was not discipline. It was exclusion by design. William felt relief, but no triumph. The prince had not fought merely for a title. He had fought against the idea that Louis could be judged expendable because another young relative appeared easier to manage. That fear hardened after he delivered Charles a file containing altered schedules, expanded security clearances, and proposals that repeatedly moved Camilla's grandson closer to royal duties while Louis was eased away. Then came the detail that devastated her most. Charles had written the protections so tightly that her household could not reverse it, soften it, or quietly work around it. The decision was meant to survive pressure. And that was when the real story began, because behind the king's signature stood a protective father, a devastated wife, and a child who had no idea adults inside the palace had been fighting over his future. The cruelty of the decision was not contained in titles or security lists. It lay in what those things represented to the people involved. For William, Prince Louis was a child before he was a royal asset. For Charles, Camilla was the woman whose place beside him had cost decades of controversy. And for the queen consort, her grandson's growing presence had become proof that her family would never again be treated as visitors standing outside the palace gates. William had spent years trying to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis from the coldest instincts of royal life. He understood that preparation was necessary, but he refused to let usefulness become the measure of a child's value. The Prince of Wales, the title held by the heir to the throne, wanted his children to understand duty, without believing love depended on performance. Louis especially worried him. The boy's energy delighted the public, yet William feared that the same personality could be used inside the palace to label him difficult, long before he was old enough to defend himself. Camilla carried a very different wound. Her children and grandchildren were part of Charles's private family, welcomed into his personal life and treated with affection, but they did not belong to the hereditary structure surrounding William's children. That structure is the line through which royal rank and the crown pass by birth. The queen consort understood the difference intellectually. Emotionally, however, every closed door still reminded her that acceptance beside the king did not automatically create an official future for her descendants. Catherine noticed the pattern before anyone said it aloud. One morning, Prince Louis laughed across the breakfast table, while an engagement diary lay nearby. The Princess of Wales, the senior royal position held by William's wife, looked down and saw that an event previously expected to include her youngest son no longer carried his name. She did not accuse anyone. She simply placed the schedule in front of William. He stopped reading almost immediately. William felt something darker than irritation. One exclusion could be explained as sensible parenting. Two might be coincidence. But the prince began noticing that whenever Louis disappeared from a ceremonial role, another proposal seemed to move Camilla's grandson closer to a reception, gathering, or privileged palace occasion. The pattern suggested that his son's personality was being turned into a weakness, while another young relative's maturity was being presented as an advantage. Camilla rejected that interpretation during a private conversation with Charles. She told the king that giving her grandson opportunities did not take anything away from Louis. He listened, but his hesitation betrayed him. The monarch understood why William saw competition, even if she refused to call it that, and the queen realized the argument had already moved beyond simple family inclusion. Catherine chose silence over confrontation. She began keeping copies of schedules, revised invitations, and altered attendance lists, knowing that one change proved little, but a sequence could expose intent. Then one particular royal occasion produced a substitution so direct that even William could no longer dismiss it as palace administration. And when that single substitution finally occurred, what had looked like bureaucracy suddenly felt to William like an attempt to rewrite his son's place in the family. Every palace conflict has a moment that later becomes impossible to forget. In this one, it was not a screaming argument or a public humiliation. It was a rehearsal list. One name had disappeared. Another had been inserted in its place. The change looked insignificant on paper, but when William learned that Prince Louis had been removed from a closed ceremonial rehearsal, while Camilla's grandson had been granted access instead, the Prince of Wales stopped seeing coincidence and started seeing design. Catherine found the revised list inside a briefing folder, prepared for a private Commonwealth reception rehearsal. A Commonwealth reception is an official gathering connected to nations that maintain historic ties with the crown, while a rehearsal allows royal participants to learn the order, timing, staff roles, and security arrangements before the real event. She ran her finger from Louis's crossed-out name to the replacement entry below it. Then she closed the folder and carried it directly to William. William read the explanation once. Prince Louis had been removed from the planned family familiarization session because his age and energy were considered potentially difficult for such a controlled occasion. Camilla's grandson, older and described as composed, had been granted clearance to observe the same restricted proceedings. The prince looked at Catherine and immediately understood why the substitution mattered. This was not about smiling for cameras. It offered access to the private mechanics of working royal life. Catherine stayed calm, and that frightened William more than anger would have. The princess reminded him of earlier diary changes, reduced appearances, and unusual access that had slowly expanded around Camilla's family. She did not accuse the queen outright. Instead, she placed several schedules beside one another. Each told the same quiet story. Louis disappeared from one opportunity. Camilla's grandson appeared near another. William felt the pattern become personal. He told Catherine that an older teenager could not be used as a standard against his younger son. Louis could not be branded unsuitable simply because another child seemed easier for palace staff to manage. The future king knew how quickly a repeated judgment could harden into reputation, and how difficult such labels were to escape once the institution accepted them. The evidence grew worse. William and Catherine compared weeks of papers and found repeated proposals describing Camilla's grandson as dependable, mature, and available. Then the prince discovered something more serious. Discussion had begun around a youthful quasi-official supporting role, meaning an informal position close to royal duties without being an established constitutional office. It would create familiarity, visibility, and influence without openly calling him a working royal. William stopped discussing possibilities. He gathered the schedules, the rehearsal list, and the internal proposals into one file. No furious email followed. No story reached the press. The prince decided the dispute would end privately, before the only man capable of drawing a permanent line. The next conversation would not be between competing palace offices. It would be between a father and a son, with Camilla's ambitions sitting silently between them. William did not enter his father's study looking for compromise. By the time the door closed behind him, he had already decided what he was prepared to risk. The king saw the folder first. Then he saw his son's face. No aides remained in the room. No private secretaries could soften the language. What followed was not simply an argument about Prince Louis. It became a confrontation over who had the right to determine the future shape of Charles's monarchy. William placed the papers on the desk and began with the pattern. He showed changed schedules, altered access decisions, and proposals that repeatedly pushed Louis away while drawing Camilla's grandson closer. The prince made one thing clear: no single adjustment was the problem. It was the direction of all of them together. Restricted palace access meant permission to enter secure working areas normally reserved for people involved in official royal business, and that made every new clearance matter. Charles resisted almost immediately. The king reminded his son that Louis remained a prince by birth and could never simply be erased from the family. He argued that giving Camilla's relatives occasional opportunities did not automatically threaten William's children. But the monarch's confidence weakened when the prince pushed the Commonwealth rehearsal list across the desk and asked one devastating question: why had Louis been judged too unpredictable to observe the session while Camilla's grandson had been considered suitable for the same restricted environment? Charles looked down. He did not answer at once. William felt his control begin to fracture. He told his father that Louis would not grow up believing his natural energy made him an embarrassment to the institution he had been born into. The prince had watched how quickly palace judgments could harden into permanent labels, and he refused to let that process begin around his youngest son. Charles defended Camilla, insisting that her intentions were being interpreted in the darkest possible way. But William cut through the argument. Motives no longer mattered. Outcomes did. William forced the point harder. One boy was being moved closer to privileged royal spaces, while another was quietly removed from them. The prince then delivered the threat Charles had feared without knowing it. Unless the pattern ended permanently, he would reconsider how deeply the Wales family could commit itself to an institution that failed to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis equally. Charles understood the danger immediately. William was not threatening a dramatic public rebellion. He was threatening something more powerful: reduced participation from the family carrying the monarchy's future. Without Catherine, without the children, and without the heir's full commitment, the king knew the institution would look smaller, older, and dangerously fractured. William left the folder behind and walked out without another argument. Charles remained seated, then asked that nobody enter. And once the king was left alone with that choice, love could no longer protect anyone from the arithmetic of succession. The most consequential decisions of a monarchy are not always made amid shouting. Sometimes they are made by one exhausted man staring at two futures and realizing he cannot preserve both. Charles had defended Camilla for much of his adult life, but the papers before him forced a different calculation. One path preserved his wife's hope of drawing her descendants closer to royal life. The other protected the direct line on which the institution itself depended. Charles studied the difference between private family belonging and official royal function until the distinction became impossible to ignore. Official royal function meant carrying out duties, receiving access, and operating within the working structure of the crown. Camilla's family could remain deeply connected to him personally without being drawn into that machinery. The king understood that once those lines blurred, expectations could become permanent, and a future sovereign might inherit obligations he had never chosen. William's warning carried weight far beyond anger. The Prince of Wales and his children represented the direct succession, the established order through which the crown would eventually pass. Charles knew that anything appearing to weaken that line would become more than a domestic disagreement. It would create instability inside the very structure he was responsible for protecting. Charles removed his glasses and returned to the Commonwealth rehearsal list. He read the substitution again, then placed the page face down. For several seconds, the king did nothing. He knew exactly how Camilla would interpret what came next. She would not see a technical correction. The queen consort would see decades of struggle for acceptance, ending at a locked door, placed directly in front of her own family. The king also understood William's fear. Prince Louis already stood behind an elder brother and sister in the succession, but that could never mean he was disposable. Charles could not allow the youngest Wales child to grow up believing palace approval depended on being quieter, easier, or more useful than someone outside the direct royal line. Charles made the decision stronger than William had demanded. He instructed that a formal decree be prepared, not merely reversing recent changes, but protecting Louis's future position from similar attempts later. A royal decree was a written decision issued under the monarch's authority, giving the order far greater permanence than an internal scheduling change. The second instruction cut deeper. Charles ordered every experimental privilege connected to Camilla's grandson withdrawn. No special access, no developing quasi-official role, no quiet pathway toward becoming an unofficial substitute within working royal life. The distinction would be unmistakable. Camilla still believed there was room to argue when she was summoned to speak with her husband. She expected resistance, perhaps compromise, perhaps another difficult negotiation. What she did not know was that the document had already been finalized. The constitutional decision had been made. Now came the marriage, the tears, and the price Charles would have to make his wife pay for it. Camilla had survived public hatred, scandal, decades of waiting, and the knowledge that millions once believed she would never be accepted beside a king. Yet none of those battles prepared her for the sentence Charles delivered privately. Louis's future had been secured. Her grandson's palace privileges were ending, and there would be no appeal through her household, no gradual reconsideration, no quiet restoration months later. For the first time since becoming queen, Camilla discovered exactly where her influence stopped. Charles told her the decision without softening it. Prince Louis would move forward under a protected senior royal trajectory, while the informal pathway developing around her grandson would end immediately. That trajectory meant a safeguarded future route into official royal service, not simply a family promise. The king also made clear that restricted access permissions, internal familiarization opportunities, and any quasi-official supporting role would be withdrawn. Her grandson could still remain part of his private family life, but crown business would no longer be blurred with personal affection. Camilla listened without interrupting. She held herself together until Charles explained that her household would have no authority to reverse the restrictions. Then the queen consort slowly lowered herself into a chair and asked the question that had been burning beneath everything else. Had William demanded her grandson's exclusion by name? The king did not let her place the entire burden on his son. He told her plainly that he had signed the decision himself. Charles watched the distinction hit harder than any accusation. If William alone had forced the outcome, Camilla could have treated it as another bitter clash with her stepson. But the monarch had made the final choice. He had looked at his wife, his heir, and the future of the institution, then drawn the boundary himself. Camilla felt years of fragile acceptance collapse into one brutal truth. She had believed her service beside Charles had gradually erased the invisible wall around her descendants. Now the decree had rebuilt that wall in permanent terms. Her grandchildren could be loved by the king. They could attend private family moments, but they would not become a parallel working branch of the monarchy. Charles then gave her the detail that ended any remaining hope. The Louis Clause had been written to survive changes in household staff, advisors, and internal influence. No future secretary could quietly dilute it. No administrative shift could reopen the same route later. Camilla understood exactly what that meant. The argument was over, because the king had designed the solution to prevent another campaign from beginning. Yet William's victory carried a cost he had not fully seen. When he later met his father without documents, aides, or accusations between them, the prince would discover that Charles had not walked away from this confrontation untouched. Once the decree was signed and Camilla had been told, the palace machinery no longer mattered. The defining conversation happened later, without advisors and without the thick folder William had carried into the first confrontation. Charles and his eldest son stood alone as father and son, rather than sovereign and heir. The anger had passed. What remained was more difficult. The realization that both men believed they had been protecting their families, and that one family's protection had required another's painful exclusion. William did not feel victorious. He had achieved the protection he wanted for Louis, but the prince knew there was a difference between defending his son and enjoying Camilla's humiliation. The decree had secured the boy's future, yet it had also exposed the limits of the king's blended family. Charles had spent decades trying to hold those worlds together. The Windsor family he inherited and the family he built through marriage could share affection. But constitutional equality meant something different. Only those within the established royal line could inherit or carry formal crown roles by right. Charles finally said what he had avoided during their first confrontation. He told William that he signed because the monarchy could not create confusion about its direct future. The king knew that once unofficial roles began to resemble official ones, the distinction could become harder for the next sovereign to undo. William listened, then answered with equal care. He had never wanted Camilla's grandson punished. He had wanted Louis protected. Charles admitted that Camilla was devastated. The king did not defend every decision that had led to the crisis, but he made clear that the queen had taken the decree as a rejection of her family's place beside him. William remained silent for a moment. Then the prince acknowledged something important. Her grandson was not responsible for the ambitions, proposals, or palace calculations made around him. William refused to let protection turn into vengeance. He asked his father to preserve the boy's dignity and private family life, even while the official restrictions remained untouched. The future king had drawn a line, but he did not want a child treated like an enemy simply because adults had attempted to place him where he did not belong constitutionally. Charles then explained the safeguard he had built into the decision. Camilla's grandson could still see his grandfather privately, attend ordinary family moments, and remain part of the king's personal life. What he could not become was an unofficial royal operative, someone treated like a working member of the monarchy, without actually holding that constitutional position. William accepted the distinction. Affection could be shared, family love could survive, but royal authority could not be manufactured through proximity. Within hours, however, that careful distinction would disappear outside the palace, reduced to 4 explosive words: Louis promoted, Camilla defeated. By morning, the private logic of the decree had disappeared beneath the force of a public narrative. Britain did not wake up discussing constitutional boundaries or household access categories. It woke up to a royal family divided into winners and losers. Prince Louis became the symbol of protected Windsor continuity. Camilla became the face of a defeated competing legacy. And one newspaper front page crystallized the entire crisis before the palace could shape the meaning itself. The story spread fast. Prince Louis had been placed on a protected future senior royal path, while Camilla's grandson had lost access to restricted royal functions. A senior royal path meant a secured route toward future official duties within the monarchy, not simply family status. Commentators immediately seized on the deeper question: where did the king's private stepfamily end, and where did the institution of the crown begin? That distinction suddenly mattered to millions because Charles's decision had turned an internal family boundary into a national argument. London gave the controversy its defining image. One newspaper hit the stands with a smiling Louis beside a solemn Camilla under the banner, "Charles draws the royal line." Outside Buckingham Palace, visitors stopped to photograph the front page against the gates. The phrase spread through broadcasts and online discussion within hours, reducing a complicated family struggle to one brutal message: the direct royal line had been protected, and the queen consort had lost. Catherine saw the coverage before an engagement, and immediately disliked the triumphant tone. The princess understood why people were fascinated, but she also knew Louis was still a child. He had not defeated anyone. He had not asked to become a symbol of victory. She worried that turning him into the public winner of an adult conflict would place the very pressure on him that William had fought to prevent. Camilla felt the opposite wound. The queen consort saw headlines suggesting she had tried to replace a prince with her own bloodline, while her grandson was dragged into a national dispute he had never chosen. Whatever ambitions had existed around his access, she knew the boy himself had become collateral damage. The palace answered carefully. Communications staff avoided denying the central decision and instead stressed the difference between royal family members, private relatives of the sovereign, and those expected to serve the crown officially. William quietly approved the wording. The prince did not need Camilla publicly humiliated. He only needed the institutional line to remain impossible to misunderstand. The frenzy eventually began to fade. Headlines changed. Crowds moved on. But the family could not move on so easily. When the newspapers disappeared, only one thing remained: the verdict written not by public excitement, but by the choices Charles, William, and Camilla would now be forced to live with. In the end, nobody truly defeated a child. That was the lesson hidden beneath the fury, the decree, and Camilla's tears. Prince Louis did not ask to be elevated. Her grandson did not ask to become the symbol of an ambition larger than himself. The adults created the conflict, and King Charles ultimately ended it by drawing a boundary that affection alone could not erase. One boy remained part of the king's private family. The other belonged irrevocably to the monarchy's future. Prince Louis kept the protected senior trajectory that had been secured for him. A senior trajectory meant a safeguarded path toward future official royal duties, ensuring that palace officials could not quietly reduce his place because of his age, temperament, or another person's perceived maturity. Camilla's grandson kept something very different, a private relationship with Charles, but none of the developing institutional privileges that had started to blur the line between family relative and working royal. Charles understood the human cost days later, during a private family gathering. Louis spoke to his grandfather with no knowledge of the struggle that had unfolded around his name. The king listened, knowing the boy had no idea that schedules had been changed, arguments had erupted, and a decree had been written partly to protect his future. When Louis eventually moved away, the monarch was left with one painful truth. Adults can place enormous burdens on children without those children ever understanding why. Camilla reached her own conclusion more slowly. The queen consort knew there was no remaining mechanism through which she could reverse what Charles had done. Her devastation gave way to resignation. Becoming queen had brought her closer to the center of monarchy than she had once imagined possible, but it had never transformed her descendants into an alternative royal dynasty. William did not celebrate her loss. The prince saw his victory in simpler terms. Louis would never be quietly treated as expendable because he stood behind George and Charlotte. His son would grow up knowing that his place had been defended before he was old enough to defend it himself. Charles paid the deepest personal price. The king protected the constitutional future represented by William's children, while accepting that his choice had wounded Camilla. Yet the principle he restored was brutally clear. Marriage could enlarge a sovereign's family, but it could not manufacture another line of succession. The crisis ended without revenge. Louis' position was secured. Camilla's grandson was permanently removed from any emerging official role. William's demand was satisfied. Her dynastic ambition was finished. The crown on Camilla's head proved how completely Charles had brought her into his life. The decree protecting Prince Louis proved something equally permanent. When private family ambition collided with the future of the monarchy, the king chose the line that would inherit his crown, and this time, he left no room for misunderstanding. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.